Power, in its rawest form, can transform a man into a tyrant, a shadowy puppeteer pulling strings behind the scenes. Lavrentiy Beria was no ordinary figure. Feared even by his closest allies, he climbed through the ranks of Stalin's regime, orchestrating a reign of terror that both fortified his influence and sealed his downfall. Born on March the 29th, 1899, in Merkuli, a small Georgian village, Beria's early years gave little indication of the menace he would become. He studied engineering in Baku, a pursuit that offered him precision, an attribute he would later apply to far darker endeavors. By his 20s, he joined the Bolsheviks, aligning himself with those who wielded ideology like a blade. The groundwork for his rise was laid, but it was his ruthlessness that propelled him forward. In the 1930s, Beria caught the attention of Joseph Stalin, a fellow Georgian who saw in him a man willing to act without conscience. Appointed head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, Beria became the architect of countless purges, his methods as meticulous as they were merciless. Arrests, interrogations, executions, these weren't random acts. They were carefully orchestrated displays of dominance. Even within Stalin's brutal machinery, Beria's cruelty stood apart. His control extended far beyond political enemies. He oversaw the forced labor camps of the Gulag system, driving millions into misery under the guise of industrial progress. The camps became a brutal engine for the Soviet economy, extracting timber, minerals, and labor at the cost of human lives. Men, women, and even children toiled in unimaginable conditions, their existence reduced to statistics in Beria's meticulous reports. Entire populations were uprooted and relocated at his command, with little regard for their survival. To Beria, individuals were pawns, expendable tools to achieve grand, state-driven goals. Yet Beria was not content with suppressing external threats. He turned his gaze inward, embedding suspicion and terror within the party itself. Informants whispered in corridors, colleagues vanished without warning, and loyalty became a currency that could never be trusted. Paranoia was Beria's greatest weapon, and he wielded it masterfully. Even the most loyal comrades feared being labeled traitors under his scrutiny. To challenge him meant signing one's own death warrant. He manipulated Stalin's insecurities, feeding the dictator's appetite for purges, ensuring that rivals, real or imagined, were eliminated. In the murky world of Soviet politics, Beria became a master puppeteer, pulling strings no one else could see. When World War II erupted, Beria's influence only deepened. As Germany invaded, chaos descended across the Soviet Union. But Beria thrived in the disorder. He managed Soviet intelligence with a chilling effectiveness, rooting out spies and collaborators while establishing networks of his own across enemy lines. At the same time, he directed the NKVD's forced relocations of ethnic minorities, most infamously the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and Volga Germans, whose loyalty Stalin questioned. The suffering of these populations, shipped en masse to remote, inhospitable regions, was of little concern to Beria, who justified every cruelty as necessary for state security. His hand extended into Soviet industry, particularly arms production, where his brutal pragmatism ensured factories operated at breakneck speeds, often at the cost of workers' lives. Beria's efficiency earned Stalin's approval, cementing his position as one of the most powerful men in the regime. He was no longer just an executioner. He was a strategist, a manager of men and machines, indispensable to the war effort. By the time the Red Army pushed into Berlin, Beria's shadow loomed large over the Soviet victory. His methods had helped secure the state, but at an immeasurable human cost. By war's end, Beria's name was synonymous with dread across the USSR. His influence reached every corner of the empire: industrial plants, intelligence networks, political halls, and the vast expanses of the Gulag. Yet for all his power, Beria harbored ambitions that reached far beyond mere service to Stalin. He viewed himself as the natural successor, a man whose cunning, ruthlessness, and experience made him the only viable heir to the Soviet throne. Quietly, he began maneuvering, cultivating allies while undermining potential rivals. To Beria, Stalin's rule was not a burden to shoulder, it was a crown to claim. But his confidence would prove to be his undoing. Beria had spent decades ensuring that no one dared challenge him. Yet in his rise, he underestimated how deeply his colleagues loathed and feared him. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that in a regime built on suspicion and betrayal, loyalty was a fleeting illusion. The man who had orchestrated countless purges would soon find himself ensnared by the very system he had perfected. Stalin's death in March 1953 created a vacuum. Beria, cunning as ever, moved swiftly to consolidate control. He portrayed himself as a reformer, promising to relax some of the system's cruelties, but his rivals recognized the ruse. Beria's cunning had always been matched by his arrogance, a fatal flaw in an empire where alliances were fragile and ambition fatal. By June of the same year, Nikita Khrushchev and his allies struck first. Beria was arrested in a swift, covert operation that shocked the Soviet elite. The man who had once dictated life and death now sat in a cell, stripped of the power that had shielded him. Accused of treason, corruption, and depravity, he faced a trial as swift as the arrests he had once orchestrated. A man who had executed countless others without pause now found his fate sealed. On December 23, 1953, Lavrentiy Beria was executed with a single bullet. His reign of terror was over, his name destined to evoke fear long after his demise.